The night was bustling at the restaurant. Waiters hurried back and forth, carrying fancy dishes to tables occupied by well-dressed executives. The sound of silverware clinked amidst the cheerful chatter of conversations. For the patrons, it was just another fine dining experience in Silicon Valley. But in the kitchen, far from prying eyes, someone was living a very different reality. His name was Daniel Carter, a man in his early 50s with a weary appearance and hands wrinkled from hot water and detergent. He was there, as he was every night, washing dishes without rest. Stacked plates, greasy glasses, silverware tossed into the sink. Everything passed through his hands. His work was essential for the restaurant's operation, but no one seemed to notice his presence. Daniel was never the type to draw attention. He didn't talk much, performed his duties diligently, and left without anyone even realizing he was there. To most people, he was just part of the backdrop, an invisible man. It didn't matter how hard he worked or how much his skin burned from scrubbing. By the end of the night, he would slip out the back door, as always, and no one would even remember he had been there. But that night, someone was watching him. Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook, was sitting at a reserved table, dining with a few colleagues. For him, it was just another restaurant where he could discuss business and unwind a bit. Yet, between conversations, something in the kitchen caught his attention. From where he sat, Mark could see part of the kitchen counter, enough to notice a man hunched over the sink, washing dishes nonstop. Unlike the waiters and chefs who moved with urgency, that man appeared like a machine, always in the same spot, always doing the same thing. Mark realized that while customers and staff interacted, laughed, and greeted each other, no one was looking at the dishwasher. For a moment, Mark wondered, who was that man? What was his story? But his curiosity was soon interrupted by laughter at the next table. He diverted his gaze and returned to his conversation. After all, it wasn't his concern. What Mark didn't know was that in just a few minutes, he would witness something that would change his life forever. Something that would prompt him to rise from the table and make an entirely unexpected decision. And more importantly, something that would change Daniel Carter's life forever. Daniel continued his work in silence, plate after plate, glass after glass. The hot water burned the skin on his hands, but he was used to it. The scent of detergent saturated his clothes, but that didn't matter. What mattered was to keep going. He needed that job. He needed to pay his rent. He needed to survive. But suddenly the sound of pots and the chatter in the kitchen was interrupted by a loud, harsh voice. It was the manager. He entered with firm steps, his face red with irritation, and stopped right next to Daniel. All the staff turned to look. "How many times have I told you to be faster?" His voice echoed through the kitchen. Daniel looked up, surprised, but he didn't have time to respond. The manager was holding a broken glass in his hand. One of the waiters had dropped it in a rush, but that didn't matter now. He had already decided who would be the scapegoat. "You are incompetent. You've worked here for years and you still haven't learned the basics?" His tone was laced with disdain. The other staff exchanged glances, but nobody said anything. They all knew that if they tried to defend Daniel, they could be next. Daniel tried to explain. He attempted to say it hadn't been him, but the manager wouldn't even let him finish. "Enough! Grab your things and get out. You're fired!" Silence. For a moment, no one moved. Everyone saw. Everyone heard. But as always, no one did anything. Daniel stood there holding a wet dish towel, unsure whether to insist or simply accept it. He knew he had no choice. He took a deep breath, removed his apron, and without saying a word, slowly walked toward the exit. What he didn't know was that that night someone was paying attention to him for the first time. Mark Zuckerberg watched it all. Every word the manager said, every averted gaze from the staff, every moment of humiliation that Daniel endured in silence. He didn't understand why, but it deeply unsettled him. He saw Daniel hesitate for a moment as if searching for an escape, some way to defend himself. But there was nothing he could do. He had no voice there. This became clear when no one stood up to help him. No protest, not even a glance of compassion. Just the weight of silence that seemed to scream louder than anything else. Mark knew that restaurant well. He had dined there several times. He had always received good service, always been greeted with smiles. But for the first time, he noticed something he had never observed before. Some people simply didn't exist for others. Daniel calmly took off his apron. He didn't argue, he didn't beg. He just accepted it. He grabbed a small plastic bag where he kept his belongings and began to walk slowly toward the back door. The customers continued their conversations. The waiters kept serving as if nothing had happened. Life moved on normally for everyone else, except for Daniel. Mark tried to return his focus to his table, but the voices of his dining companions sounded distant. Something within him wouldn't let him ignore what had just happened. Why? He didn't know that man. He didn't know his story. But he knew he had just witnessed something wrong, something that shouldn't be forgotten so easily. And then, even before realizing what he was doing, Mark pushed his chair back, stood up, and left the restaurant. He needed to find Daniel. Outside the restaurant, the night was chilly. Daniel sat on a nearby bench, clutching a plastic bag with his few belongings. His gaze was fixed on the ground, lost, as if he were trying to comprehend what to do next. At 50-something, unemployed, and without prospects. Where would he go now? Mark paused for a moment, watching him from a distance. Most people would have forgotten what happened inside. But he couldn't shake it off. Something about that man made him feel that simply walking away and resuming his life wasn't an option. He approached slowly and, in a calm voice, said, "Hey, I saw what happened back there." Daniel looked up, devoid of emotion. He let out a deep sigh and shook his head. "It's not the first time." His voice was weary, almost defeated. "But it was the last." Mark was silent for a moment. He could just say a few comforting words and move on. But instead, he did something he hadn't expected to do. He looked at Daniel and asked, "If you could do anything right now, what would it be?" Daniel let out a humorless laugh. It was an absurd question. At 50-something, broke, unemployed, and with no prospects. What could he possibly want? He shook his head and replied without much thought. "At this point, nothing. I just want a chance." Mark paused again. His eyes were fixed on Daniel as if trying to see beyond his words. And then he said something completely unexpected. "What if I gave you that chance?" Daniel frowned, looking at Mark with suspicion. Who was this guy? He had to be joking. "What do you mean?" Mark took a deep breath and smiled slightly. "I'm Mark Zuckerberg, and I believe everyone deserves a second chance. Would you consider working with me?" Daniel blinked a few times, stunned. This couldn't be real. He opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in a long time, he was at a loss for words. In the days that followed, Daniel's life changed completely. Not only did he land a job, but he also received something much bigger. A new opportunity to start over. Initially, it was tough. Daniel knew nothing about technology. He didn't understand the terms the young folks used in the office. He felt like a fish out of water. Many times he thought about giving up. But then he remembered that night in the restaurant. He recalled the humiliation, the manager's look, the feeling of being invisible. And that kept him going. Mark didn't just give him a job, he became a mentor, someone to guide him, teaching him patiently. Gradually, Daniel began to understand. He started learning, and more importantly, he began to believe that he was still capable. The man who once washed dishes was now helping with small projects within the company. He was handling simple tasks, but he did them well. And for the first time in many years, he felt like he was part of something. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Daniel never became a tech expert, but he became something even more valuable, a symbol of perseverance. And the most incredible part? He had no idea that fate had a reunion for him that he would never forget. 2 years passed. Daniel was no longer the man who left the restaurant in humiliation. Now he had a purpose. He had worth. And more than that, he knew it. One day, Mark Zuckerberg invited him to a special lunch. And he took him to exactly the same restaurant where it all began. When they walked in, everything looked the same. The hurried waiters, the sophisticated customers, the lively conversations. But there was one difference. This time, Daniel was no longer invisible. The former manager still worked there. When he looked at Daniel, it took him a few seconds to recognize him. But when he realized who he was, his face drained of color. He remembered. Daniel could have said so many things. He could have thrown everything he suffered back at the manager. But at that moment, he realized something. He didn't need to. His presence there said it all. Mark looked at the manager and said, with a calm smile, "He is no longer a dishwasher, and he will never again be treated as less than anyone." How many incredible people go unnoticed around us? How many stories like Daniel's replay every single day without anyone stopping to see? A simple act of kindness can change everything. Sometimes someone just needs a chance, a single opportunity to prove they still have value. And you? Have you ever stopped to see someone the world insists on ignoring? If this story touched your heart, leave a comment. I want to know your thoughts. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like this, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Together, we can spread messages that make a difference. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.